All right, let's talk a bit about the sign of Gemini. Now, before we begin, it's important to note that when I talk about the sign of Gemini, I'm not talking about you if your sun sign is Gemini. Although you may identify with many of the characteristics of Gemini that we'll be going over. And this is because every single person has every single sign and planet somewhere in their chart. We are not simply our sun sign, as a lot of horoscopes would try to lead you to believe. So if you really want to know astrology, you need to learn about all of the planets and all of the signs. And if you'd like to hear me rant more about this, you can check out my video on the sign of Aries. So with that out of the way, let's get into Gemini. Now, first off, Gemini is ruled by the planet Mercury and is an air sign, mutable air. Now, we said before that you could think of cardinal as the beginning, fixed as the middle, and mutable as the end. First, we had Aries, which was cardinal fire. Then we had Taurus, which was fixed earth. And now we have Gemini, which is mutable air. And this pattern is going to continue around the zodiac with the signs. Cardinal, fixed, then mutable. Cardinal, fixed, then mutable. The element of air corresponds with thought. Gemini's motto is, I think. You could tell a lot about a sign by its ruling planet, and Gemini's ruling planet is Mercury. Gemini is all about communication. Mercury is the messenger of the gods after all. First we had Aries, which was the 1, and then we had Taurus, which is 2, and now we need some way to communicate between the both of them. And that is the primary function of Gemini. Gemini is all about communication and everything that entails. Gemini is the development and use of language, which is what separates us from the animals. The one animal they did teach language to, Coco the gorilla, who has recently passed away, they taught Coco sign language, which Gemini rules over the hands. People with strong Gemini qualities tend to talk with their hands. Very animated with the hands when speaking. And non-coincidentally, sign language is performed with the hands. Gemini also rules over the lungs, which not only keep you alive, but enable you to speak. All verbal speech is powered by air. It's not the cardinal air that you first draw into your lungs. It's not the fixed air that's held in your lungs. No, it's the mutable air that you expel from your lungs. Mutable air powers all spoken language, all verbal communication. Both the hands and the lungs are dual. This is our first dual sign. Gemini, the twins. It's also our first sign that is represented by humans. The first two were animals. And this is to show that a big part of what separates us from the animals is language and communication. Now, along with the ability to communicate also comes the ability to deceive, to tell falsehoods, to communicate information that is simply not true. And because of the duality introduced with Gemini, you can't really have one without the other. You have the ability to communicate something that is true, and you have the ability to communicate that which is false. And for this reason, Mercury has a reputation of being a trickster, or has that trickster side to it. And we went over this a bit in a previous video that I did called the Gemini Deception, where a lot of times it's not the information that's conveyed, but the lack of it. It's not what they're telling you, it's what they're not telling you. And a prime example of this are commercials, where they have 30 seconds to convince you to buy a product. They'll tell you all the great things about the product, but they'll also leave out all the cons. Advertising, merchants, commerce, all these things are ruled by Gemini. So with the ability to communicate also comes the ability to deceive. to manipulate with words, to bend the truth a little, or even outright lie. That is the dark side of Gemini, and Gemini introduces sides. Gemini is duality. Its symbol looks like the Roman numeral 2, but it's actually a depiction of the pillars, the twin pillars. Gemini, the twins, if you're going to be able to communicate, you need someone else to communicate with. Communication is a give and take. You need someone else to communicate with. That's why Gemini is a dual sign. The two pillars, the twin pillars, you need a positive and a negative terminal, and the information, the electricity flows between the two. Your brain is an electrical neural network. It's important to understand this because Gemini rules the nervous system. This is important because Gemini is not also communication between each other, but also the means of communication within our own bodies. Anytime you have a pain or an itch, that's Gemini. Anytime you move, that's Gemini. Your brain sending out signals through your nervous system to your muscles so that they contract, etc. So Gemini is extremely important. Where would life be without it? But because Gemini introduces duality and the cross communication between the two halves, Gemini can jump between two extremes very quickly. So it can be a bit bipolar. Gemini is the two pillars. Of course, it's bipolar. I don't believe people have bipolar disorder at all. I think they just have too much Gemini in their chart. Now, to understand how Gemini can jump between two extremes so quickly and change their moods so rapidly, you have to understand mutable air. The very word mutable means liable to change. So in this regard, Gemini is very adaptable, able to think on their feet, so to speak, very good at weaseling their way out of things, talking their way out of things. And Gemini loves to talk. You may know someone with strong Gemini placements. They talk all the time. They never shut up. And they could be fun, but they also could be very exhausting. They gotta communicate it all. You know, I still have people, they write me 5 paragraphs just to ask me one simple question. They gotta tell me the whole history leading up to the question. You know, I wish I had that kind of time for everybody. I may have had it when I started, but I just have too many people writing in these days. But I know Gemini when I see it. Now, Mercury being the messenger is all about speed, quickly being able to communicate the message it needs to communicate. This is why Mercury is depicted with wings on his feet and on his helmet. And so another trait of Gemini is speed, both in wit and communication, because they have that adaptability to think on their feet. Now, another characteristic of Gemini is androgyny. Now, first we had Aries, which was the masculine, and then we had Taurus, which was the feminine, Mars and Venus. And now along comes Gemini and Mercury, which is like the merging of the two. So those with the strong Gemini in their chart can be a bit androgynous in their appearance. It is not uncommon. The tarot card for Gemini is the Lovers. And we went over this extensively in my earlier videos, where it depicts Adam looking at Eve, who's looking up at the angel. This is symbolic for communication with the divine. The conscious mind has to look to the subconscious mind, and it's the subconscious that communicates with the divine. So even in the tarot card, communication is being depicted. Communication, connection. Gemini connects spring to summer, from May 20th to June 20th. Gemini is also the sign of short distance travel. When we get to the opposite sign of Sagittarius, that's more long distance travel. But Gemini is more about short distance commutes across town. Gemini's day of the week is Wednesday, the day of Mercury, and its color is orange. Orange stands out, it's very noticeable, yet it's not as alarming as red. The messenger has to get your attention to be able to communicate the message. Now, because Gemini introduces duality, it also introduces choices and decision making. And this is a big part of why the Garden of Eden is depicted on the Lover's card with Adam and Eve. The choice between the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. With the serpent, free will. But with free will comes the ability to make bad decisions and bad choices, or to be dishonest. Gemini is the sign of thieves. And that's not to bash on Gemini or anyone that has strong Gemini placements. We need to understand these signs and these things so that we can be more compassionate. We all know Gemini's deception is all around us, from opinionated news media to advertisements. Gemini may have a bad reputation for deception, but on the flip side, it also rules over diplomacy, negotiations. It would rather talk its way out of problems rather than physically fight. That's more of an Aries thing. Where Aries would go straight to war, Gemini wants to talk things over, hash things out. Now, because Gemini is a sponge for information, it doesn't always remember where it got the information. So it could be quite forgetful when it comes to remembering the source of where they heard a particular piece of information. And that's kind of the thing about mutable air. You have all these bits of information that Gemini has picked up, but they're scattered around, no sources to speak of, and most of it being quite trivial. Have you ever played Trivial Pursuit? That is a Gemini game, right there. Most definitively. And lastly, Gemini's Hebrew letter is Zain, which translates into a sword that cuts but unites. Which, when you think about it, that's exactly what Gemini does with language. Because in order to communicate something, you first have to name it and categorize it. So now you have words that you can arrange and rearrange and use interchangeably to unite and form sentences, which can then form paragraphs and communicate the message that you want to get across. And that will about do it for the sign of Gemini. I want to thank everyone for listening. Hit the like button and share this video if you enjoyed it. And let me know if you want more of these, because these do take longer to make than the average video. Remember to follow me on Twitter at Frater Xavier, and consider joining us on Patreon, where all patrons get early access to Mystery School videos before they're available elsewhere. Thanks again, and I will see you next time. Take care.